The cargo manifest arrived at the port of Houston on the morning of August 14, 2026. Container ship, flagged in Panama, departed from Shanghai 11 days earlier. The manifest listed the cargo as industrial steel products, specifically 4,200 metric tons of hot-rolled steel coil, 1,800 metric tons of steel plate, and 2,400 metric tons of structural steel sections. Total declared value, $14. $3 million. The receiving company was listed as Heartland Steel Fabricators, a manufacturing firm based in Gary, Indiana. The company had been in operation for 47 years. It employed 340 workers. It produced steel components for American construction projects, automotive suppliers, and infrastructure developments. And it had built its entire business model on the promise that American steel tariffs would protect American steel producers from foreign competition. The customs officer reviewing the manifest noticed something unusual. The country of origin was not listed as China. It was listed as Vietnam, but the port of departure was Shanghai, and the bill of lading showed that the steel had been loaded at a facility in Hebei province, transferred to a Vietnamese processing center for 8 days, and then re-exported with Vietnamese certification. The officer flagged the shipment for inspection, not because it violated any law, but because the routing pattern matched a known tariff evasion structure. Chinese steel, minimally processed in Vietnam, relabeled as Vietnamese steel, and imported into the United States at tariff rates 40% lower than direct Chinese imports would face. The inspection confirmed what the officer suspected. The steel was Chinese. The metallurgical composition matched Hebei production standards. The mill markings had been partially ground off and re-stamped with Vietnamese facility codes. And the processing that had occurred in Vietnam consisted of light surface treatment that added no meaningful value but technically qualified the product as substantially transformed under trade classification rules. The shipment cleared customs because it met the legal definition of Vietnamese origin, and Vietnamese steel faced lower tariffs than Chinese steel under trade agreements that had been in place since 2018. The cargo was loaded onto rail cars and transported to Gary, Indiana, where it was fabricated into components for American construction projects by American workers at a company that had spent 6 months lobbying for tariffs to protect American steel from foreign competition. And the steel they were using was Chinese, from the country Trump had sanctioned, tariffed, and declared an economic adversary. This is the story of how the industry Trump promised to protect ended up importing from the country he spent 8 years fighting. How American steel fabricators became the largest buyers of Chinese steel in their history, and how the tariffs designed to save American steel became the mechanism that killed it. To understand how American steel companies went from demanding protection from Chinese imports to actively sourcing Chinese steel through third-country routing, you need to understand what happened between July 12th and August 1st, 2026. Because that 3-week window is when the economics of American steel production collapsed under the weight of its own protection. On July 12th, Canadian steel producers completed the redirection of 1 million metric tons of annual steel exports away from the United States toward Asian, European, and South American buyers. American construction companies, automotive manufacturers, and infrastructure developers lost access to steel that represented 42% of total Canadian production and 68% of Canadian steel exports. The loss created immediate supply pressure. Domestic steel producers could not replace 1 million tons of capacity overnight, or over 6 months, or possibly ever. Because building new steel production capacity requires 3 to 5 years of construction, billions in capital investment, and confidence that demand will remain stable long enough to justify the investment. American steel producers had none of those things. They had 3-year construction timelines, limited access to capital in a high-interest rate environment, and a market that had been whipsawed by 6 months of tariffs, counter-tariffs, trade threats, and supply disruptions. No steel company was willing to invest $4 billion in a new mill when the policy environment could shift again in 6 months and make the investment worthless. So supply stayed constrained, and when supply is constrained, prices rise. Between July 12th and July 26th, the price of hot-rolled steel coil in the United States increased from $890 per ton to $1,340 per ton, an increase of 55% in 2 weeks. Steel plate went from $1,020 per ton to $1,110 per ton. Structural sections went from $980 per ton to $1,430 per ton. For steel producers, this was a windfall. Prices were rising faster than input costs. Margins expanded. Profits surged. The companies that had lobbied for tariffs to protect them from foreign competition were now benefiting from a supply shortage that had nothing to do with foreign competition and everything to do with the collapse of Canadian supply chains. But for steel fabricators, the companies that buy raw steel and turn it into usable products, the price increases were catastrophic. because fabricators operate on fixed-price contracts. They bid construction projects 6 to 12 months in advance based on estimated material costs. When material costs increase 50% after the contract is signed, the fabricator absorbs the loss. And a 50% steel cost increase on a project where steel represents 60% of total cost is not a margin reduction. It is a path to bankruptcy. By July 28th, steel fabricators across the United States were facing a choice: honor their contracts and operate at a loss, or find cheaper steel. Somewhere, anywhere, regardless of where it came from. And the cheapest steel available in global markets came from China. Chinese steel production is the largest in the world. 3 billion metric tons annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. Chinese producers operate at economies of scale that no other country can match. And in the summer of 2026, Chinese steel mills were running at 68% capacity utilization because demand from domestic construction and infrastructure projects had slowed due to an ongoing property sector contraction. That meant Chinese producers had excess capacity, low domestic demand, and a strong incentive to export. And they were exporting to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and South America, at prices 30 to 40% below American domestic prices, even after accounting for shipping costs. But Chinese steel faced a 25% tariff when imported directly into the United States. That tariff, imposed in 2018 and maintained through multiple administrations, was designed to make Chinese steel uncompetitive in American markets. And it worked. Direct imports of Chinese steel into the United States had dropped from 2.8 million tons in 2017 to 340,000 tons in 2025, except the tariff only applied to direct imports. If Chinese steel was exported to a third country, processed or transformed in some minimal way, and then re-exported to the United States with third country certification, it faced whatever tariff rate applied to that third country. Not the 25% China rate. Vietnam had a tariff rate of 0 to 3% on most steel products under bilateral trade agreements. Malaysia had rates of 2 to 5%. Thailand had rates of 3 to 6%. Mexico had 0 tariffs under USMCA for products deemed substantially transformed. So Chinese steel started flowing to Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Mexico, where it was lightly processed, edge-trimmed, surface-treated, recoiled, or cut to length, and then re-exported to the United States with certifications declaring it as Vietnamese, Malaysian, Thai, or Mexican origin. This was not new. This routing structure had existed for years. But the volumes were small because American steel prices had been competitive enough that fabricators did not need to pursue complex import schemes. By August 2026, American steel prices were no longer competitive. They were 50% above global rates, and fabricators were desperate. So the volumes exploded. On August 1st, U.S. Customs and Border Protection released preliminary import data for July 2026. Steel imports from Vietnam increased 340% compared to July 2025. Steel imports from Malaysia increased 298%. Steel imports from Thailand increased 267%. Steel imports from Mexico increased 191%. The increases were not driven by increased production capacity in those countries. Vietnam's steel production capacity had not changed. Malaysia's had not changed. Thailand's had not changed. What had changed was the volume of Chinese steel being routed through those countries, lightly transformed, and re-exported to the United States. By mid-August, industry analysts estimated that 60 to 70% of steel imports classified as Vietnamese, Malaysian, or Thai origin were actually Chinese steel that had been minimally processed and recertified. The percentage for Mexican imports was lower, but still significant, approximately 30 to 40%. American fabricators were not ignorant of this. They knew the steel was Chinese. They knew the routing was designed to evade tariffs. And they did not care, because their choice was not between American steel and Chinese steel. Their choice was between Chinese steel at $920 per ton and American steel at $1,240 per ton. And at those prices, the choice was not a choice. It was a survival decision. By August 14th, when the cargo ship arrived in Houston carrying 8,400 tons of Chinese steel labeled as Vietnamese, it was one of 47 similar shipments that arrived at American ports that week. The total volume of effectively Chinese steel entering the United States through third country routing in August 2026 was estimated at 680,000 metric tons, more than double the volume of direct Chinese steel imports in all of 2025. The industry Trump had promised to protect was now importing more Chinese steel than at any point in its history. Not despite the tariffs, because of the tariffs. Because the tariffs had created a price umbrella so high that even Chinese steel plus shipping costs plus third country processing fees was cheaper than domestic production. Now let me take you inside the meeting where American steel producers realized they had won the policy fight and lost the market. On August 19th, the American Iron and Steel Institute convened an emergency board meeting in Washington. The attendees included the CEOs of the six largest American steel producers, the president of the United Steelworkers Union, and three trade attorneys who specialized in dumping and subsidy cases. The meeting had one agenda item: address the surge in third country steel imports and develop a strategy to stop it. The discussion lasted 3 hours. No strategy was identified, because every option required admitting that the tariffs designed to protect American steel were now protecting Chinese steel from competition with American steel. One CEO suggested filing anti-dumping cases against Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. A trade attorney explained that anti-dumping cases take 18 to 24 months to resolve, require proof that the exporting country's producers are selling below cost, and are difficult to win when the steel is technically of third country origin, even if everyone knows it originated in China. Another CEO suggested pressuring the Commerce Department to tighten rules on what qualifies as substantial transformation. The trade attorney explained that substantial transformation standards are set by international trade agreements and cannot be unilaterally changed without triggering retaliation from trading partners. A third CEO suggested asking Congress to pass legislation imposing tariffs on any steel product that contains Chinese origin inputs, regardless of where it was processed. The trade attorney explained that such legislation would violate WTO rules, trigger immediate legal challenges, and likely result in authorized retaliation against American exports in other sectors. The president of the United Steelworkers Union asked why domestic producers could not simply lower prices to compete. The CEOs explained that lowering prices below current levels would require operating at a loss because input costs, energy, labor, raw materials, had not decreased. The price increases of the past 6 weeks were not windfall profiteering. They were covering costs in a constrained supply environment. One CEO said, "We asked for protection. We got protection. And now we are being undercut by the country we asked to be protected from, using the same tariff structure that was supposed to protect us. How did this happen?" The room was silent, because everyone in the room understood how it had happened. The tariffs had raised domestic prices. Canadian supply had disappeared. American producers could not fill the gap. Fabricators needed cheaper steel to survive. And the only source of cheaper steel was China. So Chinese steel found a route. And that route was legal, profitable, and unstoppable under existing trade rules. The meeting ended with no action plan, because the problem was not regulatory, it was structural. The tariffs had created an economic incentive so strong that market forces simply routed around them, and no amount of policy tinkering could eliminate an incentive that powerful. By August 21st, the Commerce Department had opened an investigation into the surge in Vietnamese steel imports. By August 28th, the investigation concluded that while concerns existed about potential tariff circumvention, there was insufficient evidence to take immediate action. The investigation recommended continued monitoring. By September 3rd, steel imports from Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and Mexico had reached levels not seen since 2008. And American steel producers, the companies that had lobbied for tariffs, supported trade restrictions, and promised that protection would save American jobs, were watching Chinese steel flood American markets while they operated under tariff structures that made competition impossible. Now let me tell you what this meant for the workers who were promised that tariffs would protect their jobs. Kenny is 52 years old. He has worked at a steel mill in Pennsylvania for 29 years. He voted for Trump in 2016 and 2024 because Trump promised to bring steel jobs back and protect the industry from Chinese competition. On August 25th, Kenny's plant manager held a meeting. He explained that the plant was reducing production shifts from 6 days per week to 4 days per week due to competitive pressure from import surges. Kenny's take-home pay would drop by 33%. He said, "I was told the tariffs would save my job. Now I am being told I am losing hours because of imports. I do not understand how both of those things can be true." Both of those things are true because the tariffs raised prices so high that Chinese steel became competitive even with routing costs and third-country processing fees. And fabricators bought the Chinese steel, and domestic demand for American steel fell, and the mill reduced shifts. Maria is 36. She works as a procurement manager for a steel fabrication company in Illinois. Her company builds components for bridges and commercial buildings. On August 27th, her CFO told her to find cheaper steel or the company would not survive the quarter. Maria called 6 domestic suppliers. The cheapest quote was $1,310 per ton. She called an import broker. The broker offered Vietnamese certified steel at $890 per ton delivered. Maria knew the steel was Chinese. She also knew that if she did not take the deal, the company would lay off 40 people. She took the deal. She said, "I was told to buy American. I wanted to buy American, but buying American would have bankrupted us. So I bought Chinese steel with a Vietnamese stamp." And I hate that this is what protecting American steel looks like. These are not policy failures in the abstract. These are people living inside the consequences of a tariff system that protected an industry by making its products so expensive that customers had no choice but to buy from the country the tariffs were supposed to block. But there is one voice we need to hear, not a steel executive, not a union leader, not a trade attorney explaining circumvention law, someone who understands what happens when you protect an industry so well that you destroy the market it depends on. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, "By means of such regulations, indeed, a particular manufacture may sometimes be acquired sooner than it could have been otherwise, but after all, it cannot be acquired by such regulations at a lower price than the natural course of trade would afford. The industry which aims at something more than what sufficiently remunerates the workman is sure to be disappointed." Smith was writing about mercantilism 250 years ago, but the principle applies perfectly to August 2026. Because the tariffs did protect American steel. They raised prices. They blocked direct Chinese competition. They created the conditions American producers said they needed to thrive. And in doing so, they made American steel so expensive that American buyers found a way to buy Chinese steel anyway. Through Vietnam, through Malaysia, through Thailand, through Mexico, through any route that avoided the tariff and delivered steel at a price fabricators could afford. Trump promised to protect American steel. He imposed tariffs. He threatened trading partners. He declared economic war on China. And the result was that American fabricators are now buying more Chinese steel than at any point in history. Not because they want to, but because the tariffs made American steel unaffordable, and Chinese steel, even when routed through 3 countries and stamped with false certifications, is still cheaper. The industry Trump promised to protect is now importing from the country he sanctioned, not despite his policies, because of them. Because protection that raises prices above what customers can pay is not protection. It is a subsidy for foreign competitors who can route around the tariff and still undercut domestic producers. The cargo ship that arrived in Houston on August 14th was not an anomaly. It was the new normal. Chinese steel, processed in Vietnam for 8 days, stamped with Vietnamese certification, imported into the United States at 3% tariff rates, and fabricated into American construction projects by American workers at American companies that spent 6 months demanding protection from exactly this outcome. The tariffs worked. They blocked direct Chinese imports. And in doing so, they created an economic incentive so powerful that Chinese steel found another route, a cheaper route, a legal route, and a route that American buyers are now using at record volumes because the alternative is bankruptcy. The industry Trump promised to protect is now importing from the country he sanctioned, and the workers who were promised their jobs would be saved are watching their hours get cut because the protection priced them out of the market they were supposed to dominate. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.